Instead, we want to grab this.
Welcome to Digital Physio, a channel where we talk about all things recovery and rehab. Today we'll be talking about the latest feud between Athlean-X and Greg Doucette about how to fix tennis elbow. There's been a lot of back and forth between these two for the last year or so, and it's actually been pretty funny, but I want to provide you with my, expertise or knowledge as a physiotherapist, as someone who's seen a lot of people with tennis elbow. And it also provides you with the latest evidence and research about the best way to manage tennis elbow. So let's get straight into it.
Tennis elbow, who's got it? Don't you want to know how to fix it? Well, Jeff Cavaliere solved the problem.
Greg's absolutely right. It's a very common condition that we see worldwide. You know, it's not just the gym goers or people who do lift weights who get this condition. People who are on their keyboard for long periods of time or even on their phone develop these conditions. So absolutely a very common condition, and interesting to see what piece of advice Athlean-X and Greg Doucette both give.
So those of you who studied this in school, you know that tennis elbow is actually called lateral epicondylitis.
Now, Greg's absolutely right. Tennis elbow was historically always known as lateral epicondylitis, but as of recent, new research has come out to show that it's actually lateral epicondylalgia. And no, I'm not just being a grammar Nazi. Lateral epicondylitis implies that there's inflammation that's primarily contributing to the condition. However, recently, more research has come out to suggest that this is not necessarily the case.
You have tennis elbow, that muscle, it's being overworked. It's being used too much. And so what happens is you can get inflammation or micro tears, and these cause pain.
So absolutely, that this is previously known as the common mechanism causing tennis elbow. You get the tendon which connects the muscle to the bone, and that tendon begins to slowly tear over time as you begin to use it more and more, and you strain it more and stress it out more by going to the gym or constantly being at the screen. But recently, there's been a change in the way that we perceive or see tennis elbow. And so I'll be referring to Jill Cook's research, and she is one of the leading tendinopathy researchers worldwide, looking into the mechanisms as well as the treatments that we can deliver for tennis elbow, or well, not tennis elbow, but tendinopathy in general, because tennis elbow is a type of tendinopathy, which is a condition of the tendon found in the elbow. Now, if you refer to the most accepted model or mechanism of tennis elbow, it actually occurs in three main stages. And this graph here demonstrates it. It's very messy, but I'll explain it to you very clearly. There are three stages of tendinopathy. The first is reactive stage, and this is where the tendon is exposed to a great deal of stress or strain, like your lateral raises at the gym. If you do a lot of gripping activities, overexerting those muscles in your forearm. In the reactive stage, what happens is the cells tend to overreact. In particular, the proteoglycans. You don't need to know what that is, but these muscles, when they overreact, they begin to draw water into the tendon itself, and it becomes thickened. In the disrepair stage, or stage 2, what can happen is that accumulated stress, that if you don't give the tendon enough time to rest, what can happen is that the structure within the tendon begins to change. Now, a tendon is much like a copper wire. There are strands of little fibers that are perfectly aligned to create that perfect cylinder that stack on top of each other. Now, in a disrepair stage, what can happen is that those nice strands begin to become very disorganized, wavy, fray. What also happens is that blood vessels and nerves begin to intertwine within the nice collagen matrix, or the strands of fibers that we see in the tendon. And eventually, if that's not managed properly, that can lead to degenerative changes where there's permanent damage of the cells inside the tendon that just can't recover and are irreversibly damaged. So while Greg Doucette's sort of take on the pathophysiology of tennis elbow isn't exactly wrong, the current research is sort of showing that it's a bit more complicated than inflammatory changes and micro tears of the structures itself. And that brings in real life implications about how we manage the condition itself.
For me to handle. As I go out here, I'm basically asking for isometric contraction here of the wrist to hold that weight from falling down.
Okay, so when you're doing a side lateral, this weight, it's being held up by your wrist. It's not allowing it to drop down. Doing this, that's putting strain right on the lateral epicondyle. All these muscles being worked right specifically here, causing overuse injuries.
But yeah, when you're doing a lateral side raise, what's happening is that you're gripping and making sure that the wrist is locked in rigid and tight. And that's because of those muscles that Greg was talking about, are working really hard to keep it there without your wrist collapsing.
Can't wait till Jeff tells us.
So it's not necessarily an overuse, more of an overtaxation of these muscles that can't handle that.
So it's not overuse, it's overtaxation, aka it's overuse. You're doing it too much, Jeff. You're using it too much. Too much overtaxation? It's not economics class, we're in anatomy class here, Jeff.
And I definitely would agree with Greg. The difference between overtaxation and overuse probably isn't very significant or meaningful towards the management of tennis elbow. But what Jeff might be referring to in terms of overtaxation is the reactive stage of tendinopathy, if we go back to the model that we were talking about before. In the reactive stage, it doesn't necessarily take a bunch of sessions in the gym for you to get pain or changes in the elbow. It might just take one really hard session to really push those cells and the tendons overboard and to react and to not feel very nice. So Jeff's video might not necessarily be for people who've had a long-standing or long-term tennis elbow injury, more so that they've just had a small flare-up of the tennis elbow recently and just require some subtle changes to their programming to try and get over that while maximizing the gains they're going to at the gym.
Instead, we want to grab this.
Okay, so we're going to use a kettlebell instead of a dumbbell.
And the exercise that you want to start incorporating 3 times a week, if you already have a raging case of tennis elbow, believe it or not, is a kettlebell swing.
Okay, so if we're in pain, we shouldn't actually do what the doctor says, which is like prices, pressure, rest, ice, compression, elevation, support, the things you were taught when you were a kid on what to do when you're injured.
So what Greg is referring to is price. So the old way that first aiders and medical health professionals were taught to manage soft tissue injuries like strains or tendon tears, and that's to protect, rest, ice, compress, and elevate. Now, for the most part, if you get an injury within the first 24, 48 hours or the first couple of days, doing that is fine. But recently, the evidence has moved towards what we call peace and love, which can be seen here. And what that is it's a new way of how we manage soft tissue injuries, such as tennis elbow and tendinopathies. Now, the main difference between price and peace and love is that with peace and love, they don't encourage constant use of anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen or even application of ice, because you need a little bit of information to actually help with the recovery. Additionally, they've also recommended to not rest your injuries throughout the whole duration of the actual problem itself, but actually start loading the muscle or the tendon. Start with a bit of movement, start with a bit of strengthening exercise. This encourages additional blood flow, helps you get stronger, helps you return back to activities that you want to return to quicker. So whilst price is still something that I would recommend in people who've had an immediate hamstring strain or just suffered an injury quite recently, it's not a great long-term strategy of managing these types of conditions that can span on for a long period of time, such as tennis elbow.
Shouldn't wear a compression sleeve. No good. We shouldn't actually do what the doctors would tell us to do. Shouldn't take anti-inflammatories like naproxen. We shouldn't ice it. If the doctor tells us that, we shouldn't do that.
And Greg's absolutely right. For the right person, the right context, ice and anti-inflammatories can definitely help settle the symptoms and conditions in the short to medium period. But the research does say that long-term management of this condition using these type of treatments are not necessarily going to give you long-term results. So short-term, perfectly fine. Long-term, we need to find another solution for us to get back to where we were originally.
We need to start to reintroduce the rest of the body to that move. And the best way to do it is to take it from the side and bring it to the front.
Okay, so rather than doing side laterals to the side to target the lateral head of the delts, we're going to start doing it to the front with kettlebells.
So what the kettlebell swing does is it loads us into hip flexion.
Rather than using light weight and slowly controlling the weight, we're just going to swing the weight up and let our hips do it. Is this turning into a booty workout? Are we doing now hip thrust to work the delts? So I want to get boulder shoulders, Death Star delts, building up the lateral head of the delts.
And Jeff is absolutely right here. You know, those type of things he talked about, those passive modalities like ultrasound, bracing it, taking anti-inflammatories. It's a great way of that short-term pain relief, but it's not going to address the long-term problem that we get pain when we do these type of exercises. And I'm just going to read out an excerpt in a study by Jill Cook, and she says, intervening with a loading program also has the advantages of benefiting the tendon, the muscle, as well as the cortical control of our muscle, which may lead to improvements in function, a positive clinical outcome. An incremental load-based rehabilitation program is capable of modifying the balance of excitability and inhibition in muscle control, thus altering the loads transmitted by the function. And what that basically means is that exercise is a proven strategy of trying to strengthen up the tendon and get it to recover better to the point where you can maybe perhaps after a couple of weeks or a couple of sessions of exercise, get back to where you want to be in the long run.
Literally, don't do anything the doctors tell you to do because Jeff said not to in a video. Does this make sense? Does it make sense not to wear this compression? So,
now, as we said, compression is great, helps with your pain. But if we look at Leanne Bissett's research, who's one of the leading tennis elbow researchers worldwide, she clearly says that with compression, there isn't any significant or definitive evidence to prove that it does work in terms of helping people with pain. And I have seen people in the clinic where the tennis elbow brace and compression sleeve makes a big difference, but I've also seen people who've said that it absolutely makes no difference whatsoever.
3 times a week for, let's say, 50 swings at a time, increasing it to 75, 100 swings.
So he's telling you to gradually increase the load or to do more reps for progressive overload. But all you're doing is swinging more. It's not actually working it harder. You're just swinging it more.
Well, I definitely understand what Greg is trying to say in terms of the fact that that kettlebell swing exercise is going to do absolutely nothing for your delts. What it might do though, and this is coming from a physio point of view, is that the more reps we do in terms of the kettlebell swing, the more isometric endurance that we can develop in those forearm muscles, so that when we're doing those lateral raises, those muscles don't give way.
The solution you're looking for, the solution that you need to hear. You know what it is? Machine side laterals. It is not in your wrist anymore. It's literally a machine. To the gym, I don't have a machine. Bands. You can actually put bands on the arm, step on the band, and it'll pull and stretch it. So stop making excuses. Use your actual brain. The brain.
I absolutely love these suggestions. Any way you can try and find ways to go to the gym to try and work out or work around your injuries, it's fantastic. You know, those machine lateral raises, those banded lateral raises are great substitutes for lateral side raises, particularly in that period where you might want to rest or refrain from doing those exercises. Yeah, so my take, I think that Jeff and and Greg both been great points to the table. I do think that Greg's approach is probably more appropriate for someone who's just hurt their elbow and is looking to have a period where they can just try and rest and let the irritation in the elbow settle. Whereas Jeff, his approach is probably more inclined for someone who's a bit more advanced and is more for that end bit of rehab where you're transitioning from, you know, trying to rest up to getting back to what you're originally doing. I look up to both these individuals. I do say that they both provide information that might not be perfect for everybody. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is find different ways of trying to help you achieve your fitness goals, which I think is fantastic. At the end of the day, it's up to you to see which approach might be better for you. So hopefully I provided you with a bit more contextualization behind the disagreement between Greg Doucette and Jeff Cavaliere. Hopefully this information will be helpful for you in terms of helping you manage your tennis elbow. If you have any questions or whatever, just comment down in the section below and I try and get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, click like and subscribe for more.